Okay, Chapter 4 discusses constraints. Constraints are rules that are used to enforce business rules, practices, and policies. A short example would be what type of data will be used as the primary keys, what tables will be related, and what columns or fields will be used to relate the different tables, and also what type of data can be put in certain columns. The rules are used to ensure accuracy and integrity of data. Again, a variety of examples here, but let's say if it were a college or a school, a high school or a college that was keeping track of student information, when the field for class standing would be possibly your only four choices are freshman, sophomore, junior, senior. Or if it's a college, maybe you have undergraduate, graduate type data that can be entered into a field, and it's so that's one of the examples of ensuring accuracy and integrity of data. There are many types of constraints. This table on page 100 lists them, and I'm going to move the page number so that you can pause the video and read these if you'd like, but again, they're on page 100 in the textbook. Okay, creating constraints. You use the optional constraint keyword during table creation to assign a name. So during the create table statement, you can add the optional constraint keyword to create the constraints. If you don't provide a name for your constraint, because by the way, the constraints are database objects. We talked earlier about the tables being database objects. Constraints are also database objects. And if you don't provide a name for each constraint that you create, the database management system will name it for you. And the name of the constraints will begin with the sys_c and then a number. The name will not reflect the purpose of the constraint, the type of constraint, or the table and fields for which the constraint pertains. So providing your own name for the constraint is a very good habit. You should use informative names when creating your constraints, because that can assist in debugging problems later on. Okay? When and how to create constraints? Well, you can create them during table creation, as I mentioned earlier, but you can also create them after the table has been created. You would modify the existing table to add a constraint, so it would be an alter table command. Okay. And how can you create these constraints? They can be created at a column level. So when the column is being defined, you can create the constraint, or you can wait until all of the columns have been defined and then create the constraints at the table level. Now we're going to learn that some constraints can be defined or created at either the column level or table level. Sometimes a constraint has to be created at the table level. Okay. Creating constraints at the column level. If the constraint is being created at the column level, the constraint applies to that column specified. The syntax diagram, which is on page 102, indicates that in the column level definition, okay, when the column is being defined, you're going to provide the column name. Now, the constraint keyword and constraint name, notice they're in the brackets because They are optional. And again, but I want to remind you, if you don't provide that constraint name, the system will generate a name that is non-descriptive of the constraint and its purpose. Okay. Then you do have to provide a constraint type, and there are key words to dictate what constraint type it is. Okay. Now this syntax diagram looks somewhat incomplete, simply because it can be used with a create table statement or an alter table statement, rather than give a complete syntax diagram of a create table statement and a complete syntax diagram of an alter table statement. Just know that this syntax would be used in either of those types of statements. Okay, creating constraints at the table level. This approach can be used to create any constraint except the not null. The not null has to be created at the column level. The table level creation is required if the constraint is based on multiple columns. We're going to learn that it is not uncommon to have a composite key, for example, a composite primary key, where two or more fields are combined to create the primary key of a table. And if that is the case, because it's multiple columns, we have to we have to define or create the constraint at the table level. And here's the syntax diagram for that, again at page 102. Okay, enforcement of constraints. I'm sorry, I went backwards. Enforcement of constraints. All constraints are enforced at the table level. They're enforced at the table level. They can be created at the column level or the table level, but they're enforced at the table level. If a data value violates a constraint, the entire row or record is rejected. If you try to insert a record into the table and there is a constraint on one or more of the fields or columns, and the data value entered for that particular field violates an existing constraint, then the insert record statement is rejected at errors.